I will explain the conflict for control of North America, the 7 Years' War. What are you looking for? Causes and results. Major players, turning points, right? Okay, the big deal. From 1689 to 1815, Great Britain and France were involved in a series of wars, not just one, but a series, for world supremacy. These are the two great powers of this time and for a very long time. So we're going to pick up this 125-year struggle in the 1750s, or the last half. We're not even going to pay any attention to the first half of the war. The result of the struggle determined the fate of North America and, to a significant extent, just as I was just explaining, the face of the world. And so the French and Indian War. I know, it's frustrating. Come on, historians, give us just one name, please. We got 7 Years' War, we got the French and Indian War. Come on, everybody get on the same page. Can't help that. Historians do what they do. But it is roughly the same war. The conflict known as the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, began in North America, yes, right here on the home ground, between the French army and their Indian allies. Many of the Indians, perhaps most of the Indians, are allied with the French, although it's history, so it's complex, not all. And it begins against the English colonists in North America, the Virginians, the Pennsylvanians, etc., etc. The point of conflict was the Ohio River Valley. Think of the Ohio River as beginning essentially in Pittsburgh, where a couple of the Allegheny River and the Monongahela River come together. They form the Ohio River, and it runs west from the Alleghenies. It's like a huge highway flowing west. Get on that river, and you can go all the way to New Orleans, because it flows into the Mississippi and then down the Mississippi to New Orleans. And then there's a pass just to the east of Pittsburgh that you go through to get to Pittsburgh over the Allegheny Mountains. So that's the point of conflict. Who controls the Ohio? Whoever controls the Ohio is going to control North America in that part of North America. Okay? So the dispute is over what? Land. Control the Ohio River Valley. You've got that down? You've got a similarity between that and King Philip's War. The dispute there was primarily over what? Land, right? New England. Wars are often disputed primarily over land. Ideology might be a point of issue, right? But in this case, land. Not unusual. And so the French, who controlled Canada at that time, and they controlled New Orleans in the south at that time, was determined to take care of the Mississippi and the Ohio, the area west of the Alleghenies between those two French provinces, and make that French middle North America, isolating the English colonists on the seaboard. In other words, to surround them with French and their Indian allies. The English colonists of Virginia and Massachusetts and some of the other colonies, as Maclay, your text explains, were equally intent on expanding west into the Alleghenies and over. So they want the land. Both powers, the colonists, the French, felt they had historic rights to the area. Not to mention who? Native Americans who live out there, right? Which is why the Native Americans are going to choose sides here. Who do they favor? Largely the French. The English had actually purchased some of this land from the Iroquois tribe, one of the most powerful tribes at this time. So they'd bought it. The French claimed possession by right of exploration. This was the old-fashioned way. Your explorers would go out on their ships or what have you, and then they would plant their flag on the beach or in the hills or whatever and say, this is for our king. We claim this land. And the other European powers would either respect that or not, and nobody cared, essentially, about who? Yeah, the Native Americans who lived there already. Okay. So the French claimed land by right of exploration. Much of the Ohio Valley actually came under the jurisdiction of the colony of Virginia. Virginians had this vision of Virginia going all the way to the Mississippi River, and in some cases larger. Right? Wealthy Virginians, including young George Washington, had formed land companies to survey this land and eventually sell it to pioneers who would move out west. And then these land companies, the members of these land companies, would make a fortune. That was the plan. Aware of the plans of the Virginians and other colonies, the French decided to make good their claims to the Ohio River Valley. It's getting to the point where it's obvious that these English colonists, if allowed to, are going to come out and take the land. And so now the French decide to stand up for what they see as their rights. And so in the summer of 1753, the French established 3 new forts along the Ohio. In response, the Virginians sent a construction force in the dead of winter to what is now modern Pittsburgh out there in western Pennsylvania. You know, Pittsburgh Steelers, right? This is Pittsburgh, right there at the headwaters of the Ohio. You control Pittsburgh, you've made a real strong start into controlling the Ohio. It's right in the middle of the Allegheny Mountains. Then in April 1754, Major George Washington, 22 years old. Some of you are even older than George was at this time. I've got a few years on him myself. Washington was dispatched out west to go to Pittsburgh and protect the builders. He's got 120 men. Not a bad force. As it turned out, not as many as the French had out there. So this is essentially the first time that history takes note of the young planter from Virginia, George Washington. Before Washington could arrive at Pittsburgh, a force of 1,000 French drove the Virginian builders from the fort. And so they're now retreating south and east away from the place that the French would call Fort Duquesne. Fort Duquesne. That's Pittsburgh, though. It's all the same place. Not going to ask you what the French called Fort Pitt, all right? Not relevant. As the builders retreated back towards the Virginia colony, they ran into George Washington and his 120 men who were coming out to protect them. Too late. The French have already taken the fort. Well, the builders and Washington's militia, what are militia? Exactly. Militia, you should all know by now because you're reading April Morning, militia are not professional soldiers. They're just the citizens with guns, right? So, our militia today is called the National Guard. Our National Guard is 10 times more professional than militia was in those days. And then we have our regular army and military, right? Professional soldiers. So Washington and his militia, his summer soldiers, and the builders now are still outnumbered by the French 10-1. But Washington decides that he cannot afford to retreat any further. He decides to make a stand in this large meadow and hope for reinforcements that are supposedly on the way. He called this place Fort Necessity. So his men began to chop down some trees around the edges of the meadow and build a small stockade to protect them in case the French attack. On July 3rd, 1754, is that on the test? No. Good to know about when this takes place. It's not 2 weeks ago. The French finally came into view through a hard rain. Washington, now seeing the French coming into the meadow, he orders his troops into position in the stockade. But wait. Washington could do nothing but tell his troops to keep their powder dry. Washington wrote later in his letter back home, "They then," that is the French and Indians, "from every little rising tree, stump, and bush kept up a constant galling fire on us. We could barely see them. The colonials felt sure they killed many Frenchmen. In war, in battle, every soldier feels like he's killed 2 or 3. Right? But they themselves, it was obvious, were losing men steadily now. Worse, they could not keep their powder dry, as it was still raining and the trenches were flooding. And to get up and leave your trench to find a better place to shoot or try to get dry was certain death. That's when the Indians and the French would pick you off. Stay down in the mud and in the water. Still, the battle raged into the evening. At about 8 o'clock, a French officer shouted, "Voulez-vous parler?" Would you talk? He's going to surrender? No. He will accept the surrender of the colonials. Washington now knows that he has no choice but to agree. He has 13 dead, wet powder, over 50 wounded, some very seriously. He only has 3 days of food. And then the French officer made the offer of surrender very, very compelling by telling Washington that he and his men can keep their weapons. They're going to surrender, but be allowed to keep their weapons. And they're also going to be allowed to retreat. So they're not going to be taken captive, and their guns are not going to be taken away from them. Just surrender, quit the field, and go home. These are extraordinarily generous terms. Especially important because Washington knew that they would have to encounter Indians friendly to the French on their way home. And if they didn't have their weapons with them, how could they defend themselves against these other Indians? But now they're going to get to keep their weapons. So Washington agrees and surrenders Fort Necessity. But the English have been run out of the Ohio River Valley, haven't they? At this point. Virginia responds. With Washington's defeat, Virginia's governor sent to Great Britain, the mother country, for help. The king sent 2 British regiments. In the grand scheme of things, not enough troops. But he's looking down on the situation in the colonies as not being the most important thing, isn't he? What's his frame of reference? Where are wars fought and won? Especially wars against the French. Not in the colonies. Across the English Channel, there's France. The French and the English have been fighting for hundreds of years. 2 regiments off to the colonies. That's all I can spare. General Edward Braddock was in command of these 2 regiments. And unfortunately for Braddock and for the colonials and for his own regular soldiers, because now Braddock coming with 2 of the king's regiments, these are professional British soldiers, the so-called redcoats. But unfortunately for all these people, Braddock is inexperienced and arrogant. It's one thing to be inexperienced, but if you are, it's helpful if you know it. But if you're both inexperienced and arrogant, you're not going to listen to anybody else who might know better, and you're probably going to get yourself killed along with most of your command. It's an old story. You see it all the time in the war movies. It doesn't matter what war. But you've got the young officer, in America's case, perhaps just out of West Point, and he's in command of the platoon. But then there's an old sergeant who's fought in probably 2 or 3 wars. Actually, the lieutenant outranks the sergeant, but if the lieutenant is wise, he listens. And if he's not, He claims rank, and things don't usually go well. Well, that's what's happening here. Braddock's mission, of course, is to come across the Atlantic, take his 2 regiments, get whatever colonial help he can, and go back and take Fort Duquesne, Fort Pitt. Reassert British control of the Ohio River Valley. Washington, his entire life, wanted to be a British officer, to have a royal commission, to be one of these men. Not a colonial officer, he's already that. He was a major of militia. He was in command of that troop from Virginia, but he wanted to be a British officer. But Braddock is arrogant. And Braddock looks down on all Englishmen who are not of his rank, his social status, aristocracy, right? But he especially looks down on anybody who's just a colonist. Even a wealthy colonist like Washington is beneath him. And this is the hard part of this century that we have a hard time recovering our understanding of. Because today we automatically assume, the vast majority of us, that all human beings are equal. And even those who won't agree to that will say that all white men are equal, right? White supremacy. There's a small percentage of those people left, sadly. But the idea that all human beings are equal is just part of who we are in the 21st century. How did we get here? It did not happen overnight. In fact, the American Revolution has much to do with that. It is absolutely essential to understand that at this point in world history, all white people are not seen as equals. All white men are not seen as equals. The American Revolution that's coming up in the next section of the class is about equality for white men. And if you don't know that, then you don't get it. Today, it's very popular amongst some historians and journalists and so forth to look at the American Revolution and say, well, they didn't treat the Indians with equality. They didn't treat the blacks surely with equality. They certainly didn't treat women with equality. What was it all about? It was a waste of blood. How horrible. You see, they've forgotten. They assume that all white people are always equal, all white men. Not the case. It's demonstrated right here. Washington wants to be a British officer, and yet Braddock laughs at him. You can't be. You're not one of us. You're not equal with us. You're just a dirt farmer in the colonies. Braddock offers Washington the temporary rank, not a permanent commission, a temporary rank of captain. That in itself was an insult. Washington was a major, a higher rank in the militia. And you can be my aide, Braddock says. And Washington knows he's being insulted. And he says, no, I will not accept that. But Washington, man that he was, decides to volunteer his services as a civilian, as a scout. Now, please, remember this part of this history for the next, well, almost until the Civil War. It is about white men becoming equal with each other. When Jefferson wrote those words in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, he was asserting to a Europe that denied that all white men were equal. You're not, is what the Europeans would say. Most of you are lower class garbage. So in 1755, the English force with Washington along set out to retake Fort Duquesne. It was annihilated. Braddock was killed a few miles south of Fort Duquesne. The French and Indian force that annihilated Braddock's force was actually smaller in number. No matter. Washington had 6 bullets shot through his coat, but lived. You know what he said about that? God protected me. Braddock's defeat stunned Virginia. A British army defeated by the French and Indians? And all the mid-Atlantic colonies were now left unprotected on their western frontiers. Hostile Indians and French out there, and farmers out there would be ravaged by these forces. People died because Braddock was defeated. While the campaign to retake Fort Duquesne was taking place, there were other efforts in New York which were equally unsuccessful. The British were losing the war. One old Indian chief, and I love the wisdom of this Indian chief, he was an English ally. He's one of those Indians that had allied himself with the English, and he's beginning to wonder if this was the right thing to do. He said, and I don't know who wrote this down, but he said, of a small group of soldiers, English soldiers, that are leaving to go into the wilderness, he said, if they are to be killed, they are too many. If they are to fight, win, they are too few. You see, this old Indian was not an idealist. He's an absolute realist. He understands that sometimes you have to send soldiers to sacrifice themselves as a rear guard. But you send as few as possible to do that. You don't sacrifice those men in numbers that are unnecessary. But if you intend to go out and win, then you send as many soldiers as you can to guarantee the victory. He's right. The only glory in war is ending it. A wider war. So we have the French and Indian War starting with Washington in 1754. The war becomes a world war, the 7 Years' War, in 1756. And in that year, the French and Indian War took on global significance. Each state, France, Great Britain, was sending reinforcements to North America and preparing their navies for a world war. It's the only way to get these soldiers there, is the navies. Once again, the other European states, as always happened when the French and the British started to fight one another, other European states begin to take sides because they're afraid if they don't take a side, then one of these states is just going to gobble them up if they stand by themselves. And that's how a war between two powers becomes a world war. And so the division in Europe occurs like this. Great Britain as allied with Prussia. Prussia is that province of what would later become Germany that would form the heart of the German military tradition. Prussia. Okay? And France has its allies, Austria, Russia, and a little bit later, Spain. Gosh, it looks like the British and the Prussians are in for it, right? It sure does. And the numbers would suggest that. The number of troops that the French alliance can bring to bear on the British alliance in Europe is astronomically higher. The reason the Prussian-British alliance was not crushed was that in spite of some early military defeats, both in Europe and in America, it remained the stronger alliance for two reasons. One was leadership. In Great Britain, a man by the name of William Pitt rose to be what essentially was prime minister. And Pitt was absolutely a political genius, not to mention a military genius. And he unified the opposing political parties in Great Britain. And public opinion was behind his strategy. And Pitt's strategy featured making the colonial war, the war in North America, the focal point of the strategy. This is completely contrary to anything that's happened before because Europe is the focal point. Europe is where the major nations are, not out there in the backwater wilderness of the New World. Now, we today are very accustomed to seeing the United States as the world's dominant power, and that's true. But you've got to lose that thought and go back 200 and some odd years when we're not even a country yet. And the dominant powers are Great Britain and France. So to make the New World the focal point of the war seemed idiotic. But as it turns out, it's brilliant. And how do you make the New World the focal point of the war? You emphasize the weapon that the British had that was vastly superior to any weapon the French, the Spanish, the Austrians, and the Russians had. The British Navy. The British Navy controls the seas. And if the British Navy controls the seas, how are the French going to take their forces and their supplies and so forth from France and get across the Atlantic to reinforce their armies in the New World? They can't. And so the brilliance of William Pitt. So naval superiority. This is the factor that will lead in this long, long war with France. It's going to be the British Navy that provides the victory, yes. To try, but what happens is the British Navy is going to bottle them up and they're not even going to get out of their ports. Meanwhile, the British can reinforce their soldiers and the colonists in the New World. If the British can do that and the French can't reinforce themselves, who's going to win in the New World? Right, exactly. Okay. So it's going to take a few years for this strategy to play out, but that's what's going to happen. So naval superiority is the key to the British victory in the 7 Years' War, and in ultimately the wars with France that will end in 1815 when Napoleon was defeated. Okay. So with these advantages, the tide of the war changed in 1759. The British force in America was dramatically increased. The colonists now were paid to join the fight. The original idea from the king was that why pay the colonists to fight? It's in their interest to fight. Let them pay their own way. Colonists weren't all that excited about fighting, unless they absolutely had to. So now the king has decided to pay them. Oh yeah, now we're volunteering. It's amazing what money would do. So now you get colonists volunteering to fight with the British to defeat the French. Under these circumstances, the outcome in North America is virtually a foregone conclusion. The French were defeated at the famous Battle for Quebec in 1759. Also in that year, the British finally retook Fort Duquesne. Another British force with Washington along went out in 1759 and they took away Fort Duquesne. And what did they name it? Thank you. Pittsburgh. It's William Pitt, the great prime minister. Name it after him. So there's a Trivial Pursuit question. Which American was Fort Pitt, Pittsburgh, named after? Not an American. An Englishman, right? Trivial Pursuit. Not on the test. Okay. The great leader of the British coalition that wins, that's important. William Pitt. Okay. In 1760, Montreal, the capital of New France, falls. The French were expelled from North America. What is that? Isn't that what you were looking for all along here? The result of the war? The French were expelled from North America. Yeah. Even the French colonists in Montreal and Quebec, they're now run by the English. Did you ever wonder why people in Montreal and Quebec speak French today? Well, they were French cities at one time. They're English now. Run by the English. End of the war. Finally, the French are all bottled up in their ports. The British Navy is winning. They can't resupply not only the New World, they can't resupply France from their colonies around the world. They've lost. And they signed a peace treaty in 1763. So the war, the 7 Years' War began in 1756. It ended in 1763. And that's why they call it the 7 Years' War. But we all know that it actually began in 1754 when it was called the French and Indian War in the colonies at Fort Necessity, don't we? So here's another Trivial Pursuit question. Which American started the 7 Years' War? Good old George, right? George Washington. Out at the Great Meadows fight. Well, results for the European powers. It's a world war, so the European powers have their results. The British are going to come out really well. They made enormous gains of land in the West Indies, in West Africa, and they eliminated the French from India. India will become, as a result of this war, a British colony, not a French, and that will be that way for 200 years, until after the Second World War. The Spanish, even though they were on the side of the French and actually technically lost, the French kind of helped pay off their losses by giving them New Orleans. So the Spanish are out in the west in the New World, they're out in the south, the Floridas and so forth, for a later problem with these colonies. They're now ensued at timeout in this great conflict between Britain and France. And of course, the people don't know that it's a timeout. We're just looking back on it, and we see that there was a lapse of time for a while, decade and a half or so, before the war started up again. In Great Britain and France, the horrendous cost of the war had caused both countries to search for fresh tax revenues. Both France and Great Britain had fought for 7 years at least, and their treasuries were empty. And they need more tax revenues to pay off the debt from the war. That is one of the huge results. It's going to have an impact on these English colonies. So, cost of the war, debt, we got to find new ways to raise taxes. Now, as you all know, Americans love to see their taxes raised. Can't wait to raise their taxes, right? Americans always vote for those politicians who promise to raise their taxes. Thank you for laughing. But you can see where this is going to go. A direct result of the 7 Years' War. Great Britain is going to raise taxes on the colonists, and the colonists are going to say, no way. So, this creation of new taxes would have dramatic consequences for Great Britain and the American colonies. But all that's in the future. At the moment, the colonists are pretty happy that they have combined with their English brothers and they have kicked the French out of North America and everything seems great. The Indians are subdued on the frontier. You can go back to your farms and things are fine. One man, James Otis, you don't have to write that down, but one man was so excited over this unity and the fact that the colonists and the English had combined together to defeat the French. He said, what God in his providence has united England with the colonies, let no man tear asunder, tear apart. 1763. Has there ever been a more false prophet? Yeah. Results in the English colonies. That's what most concerns us. With the end of the war, the English colonists in North America thought they could look west to the Mississippi. No one would impede them going over the Allegheny Mountains and down the Ohio and out to the west. In addition, Canada was now English, not French. There's no French army out there. There would be no foreign power out there on the northwest frontier encouraging the Indians to attack the settlers. Moreover, the Indians had reason to believe that they had been left alone. Their French allies were gone. Now they're at the mercy of these English colonists in Great Britain. They're subdued. Now, they'll eventually find that that was wrong. They still have a friend. The French and Indian War had also made cooperation between the colonies paramount. Thus, the colonies learned that they could cooperate with one another. Remember, the text and the focus of my lecture on these years before the French and Indian War was the diversity, the differences of the colonies, the fact that they didn't see each other as friends. They didn't have things that bound them together. Quite the opposite. They're separated. But now, one of the results of the French and Indian War was that they saw that they had common cause, common issues. They drew closer together. They could work together to achieve results. And finally, as I pointed out as the theme of the lecture here, many colonists came to resent the haughty, condescending attitude of the British government, of British generals and officers toward anyone from the colonies. No matter how accomplished or how wealthy, that did not matter. The fact that you were a colonist, not of the British aristocracy, meant that you were inferior. And the colonists realized this and resented it. And you can count Ben Franklin and George Washington as two of the colonists who were sick and tired of British arrogance. Questions? Yes?
When the British started paying the colonists to fight, they provided sort of military training?
No, it's just the money to join your militia and go fight. Yeah. I'm not sure the colonists would have admitted that they needed British training. Okay. Yeah. Typical male response to, yeah. Anybody else? Yes? Oh, after the war was over, Europe's leaders hoped to avoid another war. But what do you think the French were thinking, the French king? England's happy with the way things turned out. What about the French? How about some revenge, right? We'll lick our wounds, we'll rebuild our stocks and so forth, our supplies, and maybe at some point we'll take another whack at the British Empire. That's the way it had always been, right? For the longest time. Okay, good question, thank you. So, what are good questions from this lecture, for the test?
What was the cause of the war?
Cause of the war, thank you very much. What? What? All right, what is the effect or result of the war? Absolutely. The good news is you guys have got that down now, and we have lots of American wars to continue to cover, so you're not going to run out of material there. That was a facetious comment. What else? What are you asking yourself as you study the note guide and the text and so forth? What?
The significance of Braddock.
Okay, what is General Braddock's significance? Good. Aren't you saying to yourself, who are the important people here? Because you know you've got those 12 identifiers, right? William Pitt, thank you very much. Here I am helping you guys out. All right, don't thank me yet. Okay. What else can we say? Yes. Thank you. Yes, what is the turning point of the war? Because this starts out badly. And then William Pitt becomes prime minister, and what does he decide to focus on? Yeah, and use what? And using the Navy to focus on the colonies. Okay. Yes? How is George Washington involved? Is he significant in this thing? No, he can't be. He's only 21. All right, God bless you all. I'll see you next time.